4 men pulled off a $100 million heist until one mistake brought them all down. I thought I'd seen every kind of crime in my 30 years on the force, but this one stayed with me, long after the cameras were packed up and the evidence folders closed. Not because of the money, not because of the audacity, but because it was so human, so meticulously planned, so perfectly executed, and yet undone by the smallest, dumbest human error. The call came in just after 2 a.m. The city was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like it's holding its breath. A drizzle coated the streets, leaving everything slick and reflective, streetlights dancing on the wet asphalt. The kind of night that makes every shadow seem alive. I remember thinking as we sped to the scene that the night itself seemed complicit in what had just happened. The bank sat in the heart of the financial district, a fortress of glass and steel. Security cameras covered every approach, guards at every entrance, panic alarms connected to the local precinct. And yet, when we arrived, the vault doors were open, empty, as if mocking us. Inside, the tellers were calm, seated in separate rooms, hands tied neatly in front of them. No shouting, no signs of trauma beyond the initial fear. The robbers hadn't fired a shot. No one had. And still, they had walked out with over $100 million. I remember the smells first. Dust from the vault, disturbed as if brushed away deliberately. The faint tang of gun oil, despite no weapons being discharged. Cigarette smoke, almost imperceptible, lingering like a ghost. The air carried the faint, metallic scent of adrenaline and fear, and somewhere beneath it all I could smell meticulous planning. You can recognize it when a crime is executed so precisely, the smell of control. The scene was almost sterile. There were small anomalies, of course, details that any ordinary observer would have missed. A smudge on the edge of the vault keypad, barely readable, one fingerprint, slight scuff marks on the polished marble floor, angled in ways that suggested hurried but practiced movement. A tiny thread caught on the edge of a teller's counter, out of place. All of it screamed, human hands at work, human pride, human greed, human mistakes. We interviewed the tellers multiple times. Their stories were consistent. The men were calm, polite, efficient. One had noticed a wedding band under a glove. Another remembered the distinctive aroma of the cigarettes, something stronger than the usual brands. I noted it all down. Every detail could matter. In a heist this clean, the smallest thing becomes a thread you can follow. Outside, the streets were alive with normal crime. Gangsters, lowlifes, street hustlers milling about, oblivious to the robbery that had just emptied the city's richest vault. Yet even in that chaos, I noticed patterns. A courier truck that had deviated from its usual route. A cab driver who remembered picking up an unusual passenger near the bank hours before. Little things. Things most detectives dismiss. Things that would matter more than anyone realized. We dusted for prints, collected the camera footage, cross-checked schedules, interviewed security staff, and mapped the city streets in search of an exit route. The 4 men were ghosts, professional, deliberate, clean, the kind of criminals who believe they are untouchable. But I knew better. I'd chased ghosts before. Ghosts always leave something behind. And for 4 men, no matter how precise, there was always a crack, a human flaw, a lapse, a moment when ego or carelessness would creep in. That's what haunted me. Not the audacity of the crime, not the skill, but the reminder that even perfection is temporary. Even the cleverest men leave crumbs. And those crumbs eventually find a detective willing to follow them. I spent the first week after the robbery replaying footage frame by frame, taking notes, marking inconsistencies. The city went on around me, indifferent. But I couldn't. I saw things no one else did. A shadow at the corner of a street, a car parked too long, a figure lingering near the bank a week before the robbery. Nothing concrete, but a pattern, a rhythm, a heartbeat that led somewhere. I knew then that this wasn't just about catching thieves. It was about understanding them, predicting them, finding the moment when their arrogance would betray them. And I also knew it would haunt me. This case, this heist, this lesson in human error. Because once you've seen a perfect crime, you can't unsee it. You just wait and watch. The first days after the robbery were exhausting, not physically. The adrenaline of the call had worn off hours ago, but mentally. I spent hours staring at surveillance footage, the kind that makes your eyes burn and your brain ache. 4 men moving like clockwork, leaving nothing behind, nothing except the faintest of traces. I reviewed the vault cameras again and again. Every movement slowed down frame by frame. They didn't rush. They didn't panic. They moved with the confidence of people who had done this before, people who believed themselves untouchable. Yet even in their perfection, there were inconsistencies. One hand lingered just a fraction too long on the keypad. One figure hesitated for a split second at the edge of a doorway. Tiny things, insignificant to anyone else. But for a detective trained to notice patterns, these were breadcrumbs. The teller's interviews were repetitive, but there were details that stuck. One of them remembered the smell of a particular cigarette, the kind they only sold in a certain part of the city. Another mentioned the faint glint of a wedding band peeking out from under a glove. I noted it all. I didn't know yet how it would matter, but instinct told me it would. Outside the bank, I started mapping movements, security logs, nearby street cameras, taxi records. I walked the streets myself, noting vantage points, alleys, escape routes. The 4 men had vanished, but the city doesn't forget. Someone saw something. Someone always does. It was just a matter of finding who cared enough to remember. I ran through the security footage over and over. On a frame I would never have noticed without slowing it down 1,000 times, a reflection in the glass across the street showed a figure crouched near a parked car. Just for a second, almost imperceptible, but there it was. And that reflection, a shadow among shadows, was the first real lead we had. We followed it, tracked the vehicle it belonged to. And that's when things got complicated. The car was registered to a shell company fronted by someone who didn't exist. The kind of people who plan heists this big always have layers, false names, alibis, disguises, paper trails that lead to nothing. But people slip. They always slip. Days turned into weeks. My team and I interviewed everyone connected to the bank. Security guards, janitors, maintenance staff. We checked cab logs, delivery records, even nearby bars and coffee shops for anyone who might have noticed unusual activity. And slowly, the pattern emerged. One of the robbers had gotten sloppy. Not in the heist itself, that went flawlessly, but in preparation. A careless meeting, a phone call traced, a name mentioned to the wrong person, a crack in the armor that would eventually unravel everything. Meanwhile, the psychological toll was creeping in. The city was talking about the heist like it was a movie. Headlines called it the perfect robbery. People admired the audacity. But for me, it wasn't a story to tell. It was a puzzle with real people inside it. People who had made choices that could ruin lives, including my own. Sleep became shallow. My dreams were haunted by shadows moving silently through marble halls, and I woke up thinking I heard vault doors opening in the dark. I began working the backgrounds of suspects. 4 men, each with military-style precision, but all human. 2 had prior convictions for armed robbery, 1 for fraud, and 1 was unknown. Clean record, clean life, or so it seemed. Each had connections to parts of the city's underworld, networks that provided muscle, transportation, and weapons if necessary. But muscle hadn't been needed, not on the day of the heist. Only brains, only planning, only arrogance. We started surveilling the peripheries, the bars, the safe houses, the warehouses, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the trail warmed. A security camera caught a familiar car near an industrial district. Not the same one from the reflection, another, rented under a false identity. But combined with cab logs, delivery schedules, and eyewitness accounts, it started to form a picture. Then came the first real breakthrough. A man walking near one of the warehouses was recognized by a bartender. Someone had bragged, just slightly, to the wrong person, mentioning a cleanest job ever, and walking out without touching a thing. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to start connecting dots. Enough to follow the chain back to the 4 men. By now, I was obsessed. Hours in the precinct felt like days. The city outside didn't change, but the one in my mind did. I replayed every frame, every conversation, every small detail. Fingerprints, glints of metal, cigarette ashes, a wedding band, reflections. They all became clues in a web I had to untangle. And then it happened. One of the robbers made the mistake I had been waiting for. Not the heist itself, not an overt act of violence or carelessness, but a slip in communication. A casual remark on a phone call, traced back to a burner phone they had thought was untraceable. It was human. It was stupid, and it was everything. From there, the case snowballed. The pieces started falling into place. One by one, connections were made. Surveillance, street witnesses, phone records, cab logs, financial transfers. Each thread led to the next, and soon the entire web of the heist was visible. Not perfect anymore, just human. Flawed, vulnerable. And that's when I realized the truth about this case. Perfection doesn't exist in crime. No matter how meticulous, how planned, how disciplined, eventually, human nature asserts itself. Pride, greed, ego, and carelessness. That's what brings criminals down. That's what makes a perfect heist a story to tell years later over a coffee with a retired detective. After the first break in the case, the investigation shifted into high gear. We began tracking the four men systematically. Every lead, no matter how minor, was followed. Surveillance logs, taxi receipts, rental car contracts, ATM withdrawals. I treated each like a strand in a spider's web. Fragile, but crucial. The city had become a living map, every alley, street, and neon-lit corner potentially hiding the answers. I remember the smell of my office during those days. Coffee, stale smoke from my old habit, and the faint tang of paper from the endless files I was sifting through. Every document, every report felt like a lifeline, connecting the dots that no one else could see. Interviews were grueling. We spoke with street-level contacts, bartenders, cab drivers, even people living near the bank. Most of them saw nothing, but some remembered small oddities. An unfamiliar car parked too long near a warehouse, a man in a suit asking strange questions about bank schedules, a delivery van that never arrived. All of it felt insignificant at first, but it mattered. Everything matters if you know what to look for. One lead took us to a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city. Nothing fancy, barely kept, the kind of place where people disappear into anonymity. A former informant said he'd seen one of the men checking in, carrying a small, heavy case. We went there late at night. The neon sign flickered overhead, buzzing faintly, and the air smelled of mildew and cheap cleaning products. The room was empty. No man, no case. But the desk drawer revealed something. A crumpled receipt from a high-end electronics store, time-stamped the week before the heist. It was a minor detail, almost meaningless on its own. But combined with cab logs and street cameras, it suggested planning, coordination, and a network that stretched wider than we initially thought. And that's when I began to see a pattern. Meticulous, calculated, but human. Human mistakes were hidden behind layers of preparation, and human mistakes were what we would exploit. Meanwhile, internal pressure began to mount. My precinct was anxious, higher-ups calling for results, journalists circling, calling it the heist of the century. It's funny how admiration from outsiders can feel like pressure from inside. The public didn't care about human error. They only cared about the spectacle. I had to remind myself constantly that this wasn't a story. It was a puzzle with real lives, real consequences. We started cross-referencing everything we had. Phone calls, rental cars, hotel check-ins, security logs, and street surveillance. And then we found it, a small discrepancy in a bank contractor's schedule. One of the four men had visited a third-party vendor weeks before the heist, asking very specific questions about a vault mechanism. On paper, it looked innocuous, but the timing, the level of detail, the way he asked, it screamed insider knowledge. From there, the investigation accelerated. We started shadowing associates, running license plate checks, analyzing financial records for unusual activity. Each connection brought more clarity. Each mistake by the robbers, no matter how tiny, opened a new door. The four men were professionals, yes, but they were still human, still susceptible to ego, impatience, and error. I remember walking one alley near the financial district late at night. The street lamps cast long shadows over wet cobblestones. I could hear the distant hum of traffic and the occasional shout from a drunk passing by. In moments like that, the city feels alive, watching, waiting, and I felt it too. The weight of anticipation, knowing that a single slip would reveal the criminal's world to us. And that slip came sooner than I expected. One of the men called someone he shouldn't have. The conversation was brief, almost casual, and it could have been ignored. But our team intercepted it. A name was mentioned, a location. Not much, just a scrap. But it was enough. Enough to narrow the search. Enough to start connecting the dots fully. From that moment on, the case shifted from shadows into reality. The perfect heist was no longer perfect. Every move they made left traces. Financial transactions, hotel stays, rental cars, phone calls, casual bragging to the wrong person. All of it pointed toward their undoing. And as I pieced it together, I realized something that would stick with me forever. The robbers were brilliant, yes, but not infallible. They were human. And in human systems, there is always a flaw. Always a crack that allows justice eventually to find its way. Once we had that scrap of a lead from the intercepted call, the investigation finally began to feel like it had teeth. I remember the moment clearly. I was leaning over my cluttered desk, cigarette in hand, staring at a map of the city spread across the floor. Red pins marked streets, alleys, warehouses, rental car drop-offs. Strings connected the pins, forming a web, messy but deliberate. And in the center of it all, one location glowed like a warning. A small industrial complex near the river, abandoned on paper but very much in use in reality. I sent 2 teams to surveil it. Days of stakeouts followed. Rain, cold, the hum of traffic at all hours. I spent more nights in my car than in my own apartment. The smell of wet asphalt, car upholstery, and stale coffee became my constant companions. Hours stretched like days, watching doors, windows, parking lots. Shadows moved, figures appeared, disappeared. Every delivery van, every unfamiliar face was cataloged, recorded. It was during one of these stakeouts that we got our first break. A black SUV arrived late at night. 4 men stepped out. Not coincidentally, not randomly. All the pieces fit. Height, build, movement. The teller's descriptions came back to me. Methodical, calm, practiced. I watched as they carried crates inside. I couldn't see the contents, but I knew what it was. Money. Evidence, proof. We didn't move immediately. Patience was key. A misstep would ruin everything. The men were careful, always looking, always calculating. But as I've learned in decades on the force, arrogance creeps in eventually. And one of them showed it. Over the next few days, we confirmed identities. One by one, the network surrounding the robbery began to unravel. Safe houses, bank accounts opened under false names, associates who thought they were invisible, thinking they had covered every trace. But the human element betrayed them. One man grew careless, using a familiar burner phone, leaving a digital footprint we could trace. A financial transfer too large, too fast. A cab driver who remembered a passenger's shoes, the scuff on the heel. The first arrest was almost anticlimactic. A young man, nervous, twitchy, sweating under the lights of the interrogation room. The smell of the room, antiseptic mixed with fear, is something I'll never forget. He didn't resist. He didn't fight. He just broke, spilling names, schedules, and secrets that tied the 4 men together. That confession was both satisfying and terrifying. Satisfying because it confirmed everything we suspected. Terrifying because it revealed the depth of planning and the sheer audacity of the crime. Hundreds of millions moved like ghosts, untouched, untouchable, until human error caught up with them. We moved quickly after that. Safe houses were raided, accounts frozen, accomplices questioned. Every day revealed more layers. Every night, I sat alone in my car, exhausted, replaying the events in my head. How carefully these men had orchestrated everything, and yet how fragile the whole operation was. One wrong call, one careless remark, and suddenly the perfect crime wasn't perfect at all. Interrogations became a chess game. The suspects were smart, deliberate, cautious, but panic set in. They knew the net was closing. And when panic meets pride, mistakes happen. One of them contradicted another, one gave a timeline impossible to reconcile, and that was the wedge we needed. The house of cards began to collapse. I remember the night we finally made the coordinated arrests. Rain soaked the streets, reflecting the flashing lights of patrol cars. The air smelled of wet asphalt and tension. I watched from a distance as the 4 men, the ones who had eluded the law and the city, were handcuffed one by one. No bravado, no movie-style showdown, just men, finally human, finally accountable. But even then, the case left its mark. The perfect heist, the brilliance, the audacity, all of it haunted me. Because for every criminal caught, for every mistake that leads to justice, there's a part of you that can't stop thinking, if one detail had gone differently, if one slip hadn't occurred, maybe they'd have walked away. And maybe the city would have never known they existed at all. The first suspect's confession opened the floodgates. but it also revealed just how fragile human planning really is. Each of the four men had a story. Each thought themselves untouchable. Pride, greed, and ego wrapped around them like armor. But one by one, that armor cracked. One's hesitation in answering a simple question, another's casual boast to a friend, a third who forgot a minor but crucial detail, all of it chipped away at their invincibility. We started with the youngest, a man barely 27, nervous, restless. His room was a mess. Receipts, empty coffee cups, a laptop that hadn't been wiped clean. The smell was thick with anxiety and cheap cologne. We sat him down and watched as the wall he built around himself started to crumble. He named names, times, vehicles, drop points. And in doing so, he painted a full picture of the heist we had only seen in fragments. The second man was older, more disciplined, former military. His pride made him confident that he could talk his way out. He didn't. Hours of questioning, alone in a small room with the hum of the ventilation system above, slowly eroded his composure. Sweat beaded on his forehead, fingers tapped nervously on the table, and then the first lie fell apart. One small inconsistency, caught on camera in a previous surveillance check, forced him to admit more than he intended. The third was cunning, clever, meticulous, the planner. He had thought of everything: escape routes, fake identities, alibis, timing. Yet human nature is unpredictable. In one phone conversation, intercepted months later, he had revealed a location to a trusted contact who wasn't trustworthy. And that single slip became the thread we pulled, unraveling the entire operation. The fourth man, the one who had been most careful, was quiet during interrogations. He watched the others break, analyzed them like a chessboard, and calculated his own moves. But even he couldn't withstand the pressure forever. When the safe houses were raided, when financial accounts were frozen, when associates were questioned, the walls closed in. That's when his silence cracked, and with it, the last secrets of the heist came to light. The emotional toll on me was heavy. I wasn't just documenting facts, I was watching 4 human lives unravel in real time. The smell of the interrogation rooms, disinfectant, sweat, tension, became a permanent memory. I remember the subtle flicker of fluorescent lights above, the hum of the ventilation, the slight squeak of chairs as suspects shifted uncomfortably. These small details stuck with me. They always do. Outside the station, the city moved on, indifferent. People walked past newsstands with headlines screaming, "The heist of the century," while the real story played out behind closed doors, unnoticed. But I couldn't ignore it. Every detail mattered, every slip mattered, and every human flaw was magnified under the microscope of law enforcement. By the end of the week, every thread had been traced, every safe house checked, every transaction accounted for. The 4 men who had walked into the bank like ghosts and disappeared with a fortune were finally cornered. Not through luck, not through extraordinary heroics, but through patience, meticulous observation, and the certainty that human error would eventually emerge. The arrest of the final suspect was quiet. Rain fell steadily on the streets outside. I could hear it tapping against the windshield as the handcuffs clicked. No dramatic confrontation, no gunfire, just men finally accountable for choices that had spiraled far beyond their control. And yet, even as they were led away, I couldn't shake the haunting thought. This was a perfect heist. Not because they got away, but because it existed at all. Because for hours, days, it had been flawless. And for a moment, it made you respect the audacity, even as you condemned it. I left the precinct that night soaked in rain, the smell of wet asphalt and tires filling my senses, thinking about how small mistakes can bring down even the cleverest. The city slept, unaware that $100 million had passed through the hands of 4 men, and that justice, in its own slow, deliberate way, had caught up with them. The look on his face when he realized that the perfect heist was unraveling, controlled, almost serene at first, then a flash of panic, that's a moment I'll never forget. The arrests were coordinated. Rain-slick streets, flashing lights, the hum of police radios, handcuffs clicking, voices giving commands. No dramatic standoffs, just men realizing the walls of their careful empire were closing in. The smell of wet asphalt, exhaust fumes, and tension filled the air. Each suspect was processed, booked, photographed, and fingerprinted, and for the first time the case felt real in its entirety. No speculation, no shadows, everything accounted for. Even after the arrests, though, the emotional weight lingered. $100 million moved like ghosts for hours. The audacity, the planning, the sheer nerve, and yet all undone by human imperfection. It was a lesson in patience, observation, and the fragility of so-called perfection. It was a reminder that no matter how clever someone thinks they are, human nature will always leave a trace. As I sat in my car that night, watching the city lights glint on wet streets, I thought about the lesson this case had taught me. Not about criminals, not about money, but about the fragility of control and the inevitability of error. Pride, greed, ego, all things that feel eternal in the moment, eventually collapse under their own weight. And for four men who thought themselves untouchable, that lesson came with the cold slap of reality. Once the arrests were made, the investigation didn't stop. It shifted, slowly, into legal preparation and psychological observation. I spent hours going over every detail with the prosecutors. Every phone record, bank transfer, surveillance clip, and witness statement had to be airtight. The four men had been careful, meticulous, disciplined, intelligent. But meticulousness doesn't erase ego, and intelligence doesn't prevent human error. Their mistakes were subtle. A word out of place, a name repeated, a route logged in a seemingly meaningless record. And those small missteps became the key to locking the case tight. In the holding cells, I watched them, not just as suspects, but as humans unraveling under the pressure of impending judgment. The youngest trembled constantly, running hands through hair, eyes darting. The second man, disciplined in the field, paced silently, jaw tight, breathing methodical but shallow. The third, the planner, sat with a notebook, scribbling numbers, diagrams, timelines, trying to reconstruct control in a situation that no longer had any. And the fourth, the one who had indirectly triggered the downfall, remained stoic at first, until subtle cracks appeared, tapping fingers, slight swallows, the occasional blink too long. Interrogations continued, now psychological rather than purely factual. We asked questions in different orders, tested alibis, represented evidence. Their reactions, micro-expressions, tone shifts, hesitation, revealed more than any statement ever could. Human pride, so carefully cultivated during the heist, began to collapse. Ego, the very thing that had made them feel invincible, became a trap. One revelation surprised me. The youngest had confided to an officer that he had been reluctant from the start, that he had followed along because he trusted the others. But fear of rejection and the promise of wealth had silenced his conscience. That's when it hit me. Even in the cleanest, most calculated crimes, human emotion is the ultimate wild card. Intelligence alone cannot prevent error when people feel pressure, loyalty, or greed. Financial records revealed the domino effect clearly. The fourth man's careless mention of a drop-off location had triggered a sequence of events. A low-level associate repeated the information. That associate's neighbor, curious, mentioned it to someone else. The network of trust they had built, invisible, tight, and assumed impenetrable, collapsed in layers. One conversation, one error, and the perfect plan became a trail of breadcrumbs leading directly to them. I remember standing in the evidence room, looking at the piles of documents and cash we had recovered. The smell of money was sharp, almost metallic. The paper rustled as I handled it, crisp and tangible. Tools, gloves, ID cards, maps, all meticulously organized by the robbers, now cataloged, labeled, and controlled by us. The contrast was striking. Their careful order now our evidence. The perfection they had believed in now held them accountable. Court preparation took weeks. Each piece of evidence had to be verified, witness statements cross-checked, timelines reconstructed. We rehearsed every scenario. I could still hear the hum of the fluorescent lights in the precinct, the rustle of files, the faint scent of coffee and ink. It became a sensory imprint tied forever to this case. Then came the twist. During review of one financial transaction, I noticed a small, almost invisible error in a ledger the robbers had kept. A decimal misplaced, a transfer logged twice, an insignificant detail in isolation, but when cross-referenced with other evidence, it exposed the fourth man's direct involvement at a level he had tried to hide. It was the mistake that had set everything into motion, the domino that toppled the rest. The courtroom hearings were tense. Watching the four men, calm, arrogant, defiant at first as the evidence mounted, was surreal. Each display of intelligence, each attempt to manipulate perception, faltered as the chain of human error became undeniable. Every slip, every overlooked detail, every minor miscommunication, the very things I had spent weeks piecing together, were laid bare. By the end of the hearings, the pattern was clear to everyone. A heist that had seemed flawless, untouchable, and almost cinematic had been undone entirely by human imperfection. The arrogance that had made the crime bold became their undoing. Their own overconfidence, combined with the natural unpredictability of human behavior, had left a trail for us to follow. Even after the final testimonies, I sat alone in the precinct late at night, reviewing footage, transcripts, and notes. The city outside was quiet, rain streaking the streets, lights reflecting on asphalt. I thought about the perfect timing of their movements, the meticulous planning, and the human errors that had undone them. And I realized, in every crime, no matter how intelligent, there's always a moment when human nature will betray it. The final phase of the case wasn't about chases or dramatic confrontations. It was about consequences. Watching the four men navigate the legal system was like observing a slowly collapsing structure. Each one had believed in his own invincibility, in the meticulous planning that had guided the heist. But the same arrogance that fueled their success now fed their unraveling. Courtroom after courtroom, testimony after testimony, their stories began to crumble. Witnesses corroborated timelines. Financial records painted a precise picture. Every lie was exposed, every inconsistency magnified. The youngest man, barely 27, pleaded for leniency. His voice trembled. His eyes darted constantly, betraying the fear that had been buried under bravado. It was obvious to everyone that his role, while criminal, had been influenced by the others. Yet the law has little patience for hesitation when millions are involved. His confession, detailed and honest, earned him a slightly reduced sentence, but it wasn't mercy. It was accountability. The second man, the disciplined former military, tried to rationalize his actions. He had believed in structure, in control, in logic, yet human error had infiltrated even his best-laid plans. His calm demeanor broke once inconsistencies in his story were revealed. Every nod, every subtle change in his tone was catalogued in the courtroom records. Even the sharpest mind cannot anticipate all variables when humans are involved. The planner, the one with notebooks, maps, and calculations, remained arrogant almost until the end. But when the financial audit and phone records were laid bare, it was clear that no system he created was flawless. Every layer of planning had a gap. Every trusted contact had a potential leak. And it was that realization, visible only in the subtle tremor of his hand and the tightening of his jaw, that confirmed the totality of their downfall. And then there was the fourth man, the quiet, calculating one whose single careless remark had set off the chain reaction. Watching him in court, I could see the weight of that mistake pressing down. The realization of his pivotal role, combined with the inescapable evidence, left him almost silent. Human error, pride, ego, or a fleeting lapse in judgment had undone the entire operation. The very flaw he had underestimated became the instrument of his undoing. Throughout the hearings I observed, listened, and recorded. The sound of the courtroom, murmurs, gavel strikes, the rustle of papers, etched itself into my memory. Every tiny detail mattered. A paused breath, a shuffled foot, the slight crease on a forehead when a truth was revealed. Crime isn't just about acts, it's about human reaction, the psychology of choices, and the inevitability of mistakes. After the sentencing, the city returned to its indifferent rhythm. People walked past the courthouse, unaware of the audacity of the crime or the meticulous unraveling that had followed. For the four men, life had changed irreversibly. The wealth they had stolen, the brilliance they had displayed, and the pride they had carried now meant nothing. For me, the emotional residue lingered. I had spent weeks, months, immersed in their world, watching brilliance undone by human flaws. The rain on asphalt, the flicker of streetlights, the faint hum of distant traffic, all these details became part of the story I would carry forever. The perfect heist had been executed, admired, feared, and then destroyed, not by skill or force, but by human nature itself. I think back now, years later, and I understand the lesson more clearly. No matter how meticulous, how intelligent, how seemingly untouchable a plan may be, Human imperfection is inescapable. Pride, carelessness, and ego are constants. And in those constants, justice eventually finds its way. As I sat in my office for the last time, the city lights glinting on wet streets outside, I realized the truth about this case. Perfection exists only in the moment, and the moment, no matter how brilliant, is fragile. The trial ended, the sentences were handed down, and the city moved on. But I didn't. Walking through the streets after the courtroom, the rain had stopped, leaving a sheen on asphalt that reflected the neon glow of signs and traffic lights. The hum of engines, the occasional shout, the soft squeak of shoes on wet pavement, every sound reminded me of the months I had spent chasing shadows. The case was over on paper, but in my mind it remained alive, vivid and insistent. I spent the next few weeks reviewing every moment of the investigation. Surveillance footage, interrogation transcripts, financial records, witness statements. Every tiny detail, every human error, every decision that had led to the undoing of the perfect heist. The smell of paper, ink, and coffee filled my office as I sifted through the evidence. The process was methodical, almost ritualistic. It was the only way I could make sense of the scale of the crime, the brilliance of the planning, and the inevitability of their downfall. Even with everything accounted for, some questions lingered. How had they coordinated with hundreds of minor players, thugs, and associates without anyone tipping us off? How had they managed to move 100 million without detection for hours? The scale of their audacity was staggering, almost incomprehensible. And yet, it all came down to small mistakes, the frailty of human planning, the unpredictability of human behavior. I revisited the fourth man in solitary confinement through our reports. His demeanor remained quiet, stoic, reflective, but the records hinted at guilt, at the weight of realizing that a single comment had unraveled everything. The perfect heist had been ruined not by force, not by superior tactics, but by human imperfection. That truth haunted me more than the crime itself. I began to understand that this case wasn't just about money or law enforcement. It was about human nature, about pride and fear, intelligence and error. Even the most calculated plans are fragile when executed by people, and even the cleverest criminals are vulnerable to their own instincts and impulses. Sometimes at night, I replayed the surveillance footage in my mind, the four men moving like shadows through the city, confident, precise, unstoppable, until one small slip started the cascade. I could hear the hum of the streets, the patter of rain, the distant siren, and imagine their panic rising in real time. That moment, when planning meets imperfection, is the space where justice exists. The city never noticed the nuances. To most, it was simply the heist of the century. A headline, a story. But for me, it was an intricate puzzle of human behavior, an examination of flaw and brilliance, risk and consequence. Every decision they made, every route they took, every lie they told, was part of a fragile ecosystem that eventually collapsed. I thought about the other investigations I had done, the cases that never reached resolution, and I realized something. Perfection, in any human endeavor, is fleeting. And what we often call genius or brilliance is nothing more than an illusion, until human error brings it crashing down. Even years later, the case lingers in my mind, not because of the money, not because of the arrests, but because of the interplay between human brilliance and human fragility. Every step, every breath, every choice mattered. And the one who thought himself untouchable, whose minor mistake had begun the unraveling. His error is a reminder of a universal truth. Nothing involving humans is ever truly perfect. The city had moved on, but I never did. I drove through rain-slick streets late at night, alone, lights reflecting off wet asphalt. Streetlights flickered, a siren wailed in the distance, and the faint smell of gasoline mixed with damp concrete filled the air. The memory of that heist, of the months it took to unravel, was alive in every shadow. I could almost feel the presence of those four men, confident and untouchable, moving through the same streets I drove now. Even with convictions, some things stayed unresolved. The human element of the crime, why they had chosen certain routes, why one man trusted another so implicitly, why a single word had triggered their downfall, remained partially unknowable. I had all the evidence, all the confessions, and yet the deeper questions lingered like smoke in a room that never clears. I thought about the youngest man, his fear, his hesitation, the internal conflict that had driven him to follow along. I thought about the disciplined ex-military man, whose logic had failed him in subtle human ways. The planner, meticulous and brilliant, undone by his overconfidence. And the fourth man, the one careless remark, the trigger, the domino. Human nature had dictated the outcome more than skill or planning ever could. I spent hours walking the city streets where they had once moved freely, retracing steps, revisiting the banks, warehouses, and alleys. The faint echoes of their audacity haunted every corner. Neon signs flickered, traffic hummed, distant voices called to one another. And I realized something about crimes like this. They leave more than evidence. They leave an imprint on memory, a resonance that persists long after the physical traces are gone. The perfect heist had existed for hours, for minutes, for moments when the world seemed frozen and the robbers believed themselves invisible. And for those hours, they were untouchable, brilliant, almost mythic. Yet all it took was a small human misstep to undo it all. A misremembered route, a careless phrase, a flicker of ego, and suddenly perfection collapsed under the weight of human flaw. Even now, years later, I think about the lessons this case taught me, about observation, patience, and the inevitability of error, about how brilliance is fragile, how ego can betray even the most meticulous mind, about justice, slow, deliberate, but inevitable when human weakness leaves a trace. I sometimes sit in silence, imagining the city without this heist, the streets empty of that brief, audacious moment of perfection, and I realize that the memory of it is what lingers most. Not the money, not the arrests, not even the notoriety, but the tension, the human calculus, the fragile chain of decisions that brought audacity and error together in a single, unforgettable narrative. The rain had long stopped, the streets glimmered under the soft glow of late-night lights, and the city breathed its usual rhythm. But for me, the memory remained alive. Perfect for a brief moment, imperfect forever, brilliant, audacious, human. And that is the truth that haunts me. No matter how clever, how calculated, how meticulous, human error is unavoidable. It is the single constant in every crime, the single thread that unravels even the most intricate design. And sometimes, that thread is the only thing that lets justice exist. I turned the key in my car and drove on, the hum of the engine echoing in the empty streets, the rain-soaked city reflecting back the memory of 4 men, 1 slip, and the 100 million that nearly vanished into legend.